What's the cost?
Tonight, the brain's delicate first months. Major funding for The Secret Life of the Brain is provided by the National Science Foundation, America's investment in the future. Funding is also provided by...
At Pfizer, we're spending nearly $5 billion looking for the cures of the future. We have 12,000 scientists and health experts who firmly believe the only thing incurable is compassion. Pfizer, life is our life's work.
The Medtronic Foundation, on behalf of Medtronic, providing lifelong solutions for people with chronic disease. Medtronic, when life depends on medical technology.
The Park Foundation, dedicated to education and quality television. The Dana Foundation, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
Put them side by side. The one the other will contain. And you decide. The brain is deeper than the sea. For hold them, blue to blue. The one the other will absorb, as sponges, buckets do. The brain is just the weight of God. For heft them, pound for pound, and they will differ, if they do, as syllable from sound. A baby's brain, less than 1 pound gelatinous tissue, and within its milky, convoluted folds, a universe of meaning. Emotions, ideas, memories, dreams, all will somehow find a home here, evolving and changing over a lifetime.
The ultimate machine and the ultimate source of everything. We understand the world the way we do because of the brains we have. We will understand the brain itself the way we will because of the brains we have.
The brain is the most complex thing on earth. Even the brain of a baby is wildly complicated.
A piece of the brain, the size of a grain of rice, contains about 10,000 nerve cells. Just an empty piece. You can just imagine how many pieces you have in your head. Within that 10,000 nerve cells, each nerve cell can make anywhere between 1 to 10,000 connections with other nerve cells. So there are something like 1 trillion connections. It's almost overwhelming to think about the whole thing, to think about how the whole brain and nervous system gets assembled. You know, you can throw your hands and say, it's way too complicated, we're never going to understand it. The brain is the seat of our consciousness, of who we are, and understanding where it comes from, we understand where we come from.
They tend to romanticize anything that has to do with the brain because there's overwhelming numbers, right? They talk a lot about regulating neurons, things like that. But remember, the rules for all of this stuff are in your genes. So the genetic part of this is pretty well understood. So here comes, excuse me, they're going to introduce the problem part of this.
was born less than 2 weeks ago. 3 months before she was expected. 3 months before she was ready to leave the world.
She was 28 weeks and 6 days. She weighed 3 pounds and she was 14 inches long. It was something about me not knowing what a preemie would look like. It's something you don't expect. You're suddenly in this medical world rather than the world of taking your baby home and trying to figure out how to dress it and change its diaper.
Elizabeth is a healthy, premature baby. Her lungs actively sucking the air. Her heart beats on its own. But the one organ central to all the others is not fully prepared. Her brain. The miracle technologies of modern medicine can help keep Elizabeth alive. But 12 critical weeks of brain development must now continue outside the protective walls of the womb.
When the baby comes out of the womb, everything changes. Suddenly light, suddenly sharp sounds. The brain reacts to the stimulation. It can't filter, it can't stop, it can't shut it out. They survive and make the best of it. Yet what's the cost?
The brain of a baby born 3 months premature is vulnerable. Many precious weeks of development still remain. Billions of brain cells are not done forging links with billions of other brain cells. Eventually, there will be trillions and trillions of connections between cells, charged with electrical pulses, rippling like lightning storms across the hills and valleys of the brain's deeply furrowed tissue. Every cell in its place, every link between cells carefully organized. Nothing random, nothing arbitrary.
What we would really love to understand is how the brain, during development, generates millions and millions of neurons, sends them to the right position in the brain, and then somehow instructs each of those individual nerve cells to form very, very specific connections with one another. You can think about development like a play that follows a script that is written down by the genetic code, but it has no director, it has no producer, and it has a bunch of actors that have never spoken their lines before. Despite all this, you pull the play off. To me, that's a miracle.
Yes, to go through this part, pay attention to they describe the different stages: germination, proliferation, migration. Underscore specifically neuronal development, but all of them. I think they use video pretty well, so pay attention to the picture.
Egg and sperm. Their union forms a single cell, which will divide and divide and divide again. Within 3 weeks, the multiplying cells have curled into a quivering oval ball. Inside lies a cluster of cells that have begun to fold themselves into the shape of a garden hose, the neural tube. From the bottom will come the spinal cord. From the top, the brain. Here lies the primitive beginning of all our thoughts and feelings. By 4 weeks, just as a woman is discovering she is pregnant, the first brain cells, the neurons, are already forming at an astonishing rate. 500,000 neurons every minute. Neurons that will never reproduce themselves, and rarely be replaced.
And that's amazing, because if you think about it, most cells in your body turn over. If you think about your skin, you're constantly, it's sort of disgusting, you're constantly sloughing off dead skin cells. And someone calculated once that if you look at the turnover of skin across a lifetime, you're probably generating and shedding about 90 pounds of skin. So most cells in the body do their thing, and then they die and they're replaced. Neurons are born in fetal life, and then those very cells are the ones that are still functioning all the way into old age.
As the tiny fetus grows, the neurons make their way out from inside the neural tube to build the brain, layer upon layer, like an onion. The neurons follow a cellular pathway, as if they were traveling down a highway. They just grab hold of supporting cells called glia and propel themselves along.
They put their nucleus in the back of the cell, which makes them sort of fat in the back, and then they hold on to the guide wire, this glial fiber. So it's kind of like an inchworm as it goes along. And each little cell goes all by itself in what is a very, very vulnerable process. No other kind of cell has to do that. It's just an amazing thing.
Neurons travel in waves, millions every day, embarking on a daunting expedition that scientists call migration.
It's an amazing film because it's as if they're going across the country. I mean, in terms of the distances relative to their size, they're making a huge odyssey through all kinds of foreign territory. And the most amazing thing about this migration is that they generally do it without mistakes. They're following cues along the way that are telling them exactly where to go.
For years, scientists wondered how the migrating neurons find their place in the brain. Do the neurons simply travel in herds, gliding down a glial highway which takes them to their final destination? Or do neurons do their own travel, each neuron genetically programmed to fulfill its own predetermined purpose?
We used to think that migration was just like delivering cells out of a conveyor belt. They would just dump out the cells at the end. But now we know that's not the case. There's evidence that shows that young neurons have an idea about where they're migrating to, and that they can recognize their position within the brain.
In her laboratory at Stanford University, neurobiologist Susan McConnell devised a series of experiments to track the destiny of a migrating neuron. Neurons are born from the division of stem cells, the seeds from which the tissues of the body grow. Some stem cells can transform themselves into any kind of cell: blood, skin, heart, bone, or brain cell. McConnell took a descendant of a stem cell, and before it morphed into a neuron, transplanted it into a developing brain. Then watched it migrate. She found that the fate of the soon-to-become neuron was determined by the neurons that were its neighbors. It traveled beside them and took on the same function they did.
That cell is plastic. It's still listening to signals from the outside. It gets the instructions from the new neighbors, and it resets its fate. It says, yeah, sure, I can do that too.
But when McConnell transplanted a neuron, it was true to its own genetic destiny. It followed its own path and took on an entirely different function from the cells surrounding it.
What this result tells us is that by the time a young neuron begins its migration, it has already received instructions about what to become. It knows. It goes into a new environment, and even though everyone else in the brain, all these other young neurons are going to position A, it says, no, I'm supposed to go to position B, and that's exactly what it does.
That's determination. It's been determined what it's going to be that migrates. The rules for that are in the gene.
By 24 weeks, the vital organs of the fetus are well formed. The primitive heart can beat on its own. The once powerless lungs are now prepared to fill with air. And the brain has nearly its full complement of billions and billions of neurons, reaching out to each other, building connections with mind-boggling speed, nearly 2 million every second, until the brain has become a tightly packed network of trillions of crisscrossing wires, with more connections than the stars in the sky.
You can imagine the size of the wiring problem. So how is that problem solved? How is that achieved during development? How is it that each one of those trillion connections is made appropriately?
You might think, oh, what a mess. It's just going to be a jumble of connections and wires all over the place. But in fact, the nervous system seems to have a strategy.
The strategy is in the genes. The brain begins to wire itself by following a precisely specified genetic blueprint.
The connections are following very defined rules. Go out of the eye, turn right, the optic chiasm, cross the chiasm, head toward the lateral geniculate nucleus, grow into the lateral geniculate nucleus. Don't grow into the medial geniculate nucleus because that's an auditory structure. So you can imagine the first stage of brain wiring is kind of like solving the problem of connecting phones in New York to phones in Boston. Making sure that you're making connections between Boston and New York and not Boston and Washington, D.C. And that's all specified genetically. Now then there's a second phase of brain wiring. Let's say you want to place a phone call to your grandmother in New York. You want that phone to ring, on Park Avenue at 47th or whatever. You don't want the phone to ring up at the Waldorf Astoria. Okay, how do you get that precise phone to ring? That's the second phase of brain wiring. If you place a phone call to your grandmother early in development, her phone will ring. But so will a lot of other phones. So there are a lot of connections that are made. If the connections are correct and being used, they get strengthened. If they're not being used, or they're only being used occasionally, they're lost. We could call it use it or lose it. The field brain is really a dynamic structure that's constantly changing in response to this process of strengthening appropriate connections and pruning inappropriate connections. Getting the circuits turned up takes a long time. So it can't happen overnight because you have literally billions of connections to check. When a child is born prematurely, the process is only partly over. So a huge amount of brain wiring is having to happen in the nursery.
So where's brain development supposed to occur? Which environment?
In utero.
And kind of think, what's that environment like? Noisy or somewhat free of distraction, right? Okay, that means that all the testing, and it is a weird thing about brain development, is occurring from the inside out, not the outside in. Okay, so the genes are sending out signals that are essentially testing its lines to make sure that everything's connected up correctly. If the interaction with the outside world acts as an impediment, okay? So you saw the normal, right? So somebody's got to write down 16 minutes, and we'll start this at 16 on Thursday. Have a great day. I'll see you guys. What do you want Wednesday?